trying to translate something inherent and essential about what it is to have a human experience, something that's been put aside and put to sleep. And our words are merely clumsy attempts to get those to look again and to reawaken our connection with that. So coming in at the grassroots place with practices that afford us the cognitive flexibility to be able to sense ourselves in the mythic sense as well as the intellectual sense, to take our modern capacity to understand and reason to pull those other things forward in a way that's satisfying to our whole being.
I'm so excited to introduce the 360 Degrees Human podcast, a holistic loudspeaker that's normalizing what it means to live into your whole being. I'm Gina Levy, founder of 360 Degrees Human and your podcast host. Each episode is a holistic masterclass explored through natural conversations and storytelling that intend to uncondition and re-educate, inspire and empower. Here you'll meet my network of paradigm-shifting life champions, movement magicians, mind maestros, soul food farmers, well-being coaches, spiritual teachers, nature wanderers, and humanpreneurs who will make it easy for you to integrate holism into your daily life so you can live whole and happily ever now. That's why this isn't an interview, it's an education in living whole in real time from exactly where you are. So what does your best day look like? And what if it was every day? Hey everybody, welcome back to the 360 Degrees Human podcast and another phenomenal guest. You can't miss him. He's otherworldly. He comes barefoot and wrapped in tattoos with encyclopedic knowledge about how and why we move. He's a wizard, a shaman, and a modern-day ancient world philosopher. He's a visionary of living anatomy, movement, embryology, fascial research, mythology, wonder, and magic. Quite simply, he's a true original. While others are hashtagging handstands or crow pose, he's hashtagging Soma-naut, psychedelic movement, Tao of the body, unlearning, sailing gravity, elephant trunk, and spiderman fingers. Meet Carlos Tao, who's on a quest to awaken us to a return to wonder, to the intelligence of the body in motion, and what it means to be alive. His teachings on the secret of human movement are not a practice, a method, or a technique, but an experience, because the truth is found in experiencing yourself as you really are. While he travels around the world offering workshops, trainings, and experiences in both English and Spanish, not one class is the same, and no one description is enough. He is like the flirt he describes, ever-changing and finding new connections and pathways, constantly reframing and refining his art. Speaking to Carlos is like liftoff for my spirit. His innate embodiment of magic is so acute that it bounces off the cosmos and into my bones. I believe this conversation will radically transform the way you see, feel, and move forever. Know one thing, this is going to be a magical ride, so get ready. I am so happy that you're finally here in my hometown. I remember very clearly when we first met. It was in 2017, and I had come to do some courses and workshops in traditional Chinese medicine, Qigong, and yoga for about 2 months in Bali. I didn't even know about you when I booked. In fact, you didn't even appear on any studio's marketing sites when I researched. But when you showed up one day, out of nowhere, I felt like I'd found my pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I knew in the first 5 minutes of the first class that this was unlike any movement practice I'd ever experienced before. And I've moved my whole life across multiple disciplines and styles in dance, yoga, sport, martial arts, and everything in between. You really followed no tradition or style, and you used your own made-up movements and language and mythology to reference other worlds. You kind of contained something magical I could identify with in a certain tongue that I could understand, with this twinkle of childlike innocence and wonder I could relate to. I recognized you immediately as my kindred spirit, and I knew instantly that you had much to teach, reteach, and remind me of. Carlos, I was like a moth to a flame. I mean, I don't think I left your side. I couldn't believe that you were undiscovered, but I knew straight away that you were destined to make a huge dent in the world of movement and yoga. Not only did I want to know the magical formula, but I wanted to share you with everyone I knew back in South Africa and beyond. And I finally convinced you to come to Cape Town for Spirit Fest, our local Bali Fest, back in February 2020, just before COVID. And now I have the privilege of having you on my podcast so I can fulfill my promise of sprinkling and spreading your magic. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for those two kind words. I can't believe it's been that many years already that we've been trying to get to this moment, I think.
Yeah, but we made it. So I wanted to start with you at the beginning. There's very little public information about you or your life before you embarked on this mystical journey, even though I know that it wasn't always this way. So can you tell us about the evolution from Carlos Sanchez to Carlos Tao?
To me, that's the least interesting
We're gonna get more interesting, of course.
It was a more subtle transition than people realize. It wasn't one big moment of anything, really. It was a continuation of a quest that I felt early on. It went through different stages. Movement wasn't my first love at all. Philosophy, I think, was a doorway in questioning and wonder and curiosity and a dissatisfaction with the answers. The questions were always more intimate to me, and the answers felt like strangers. That was the beginning of something, and that took many, many, many forms. It's evolved over time. It evolved from being within very, very traditional religion early on. I was an altar boy, so I was
Hard
deeply,
to believe.
I know.
Yeah.
This is what being an altar boy will do to you after a while,
exactly.
if you don't watch out. It evolved from that into a disillusionment with that, into an attempt to ease the ache and the longing in different ways with psychedelics, and at least was different enough from the answers that were not nourishing that it became an obsession in a sense. It was touching into another world from a very beautiful intention to wanting to re-enchant our understanding of who we are and what existence is. But going through that path, the cost is extremely high. That led down a 10-year darkness of getting further and further away from or disconnected from a mythos or an understanding of the world that spread out in both directions. So even during that time, even during the addiction and the disconnection with reality, there was still this unfolding that seemed to be happening within that, which was, it's almost unpopular to say something like that there was some kind of benefit to being in this darkness, but there truly was. The problem was that the cost was so high. The cost was so high, and it wasn't a meta understanding. And when I say meta, I mean an understanding or a vision that moved in two directions, that was able to go this way, but also really ground into this world, into the material world, and into society in a way that it afforded me a capacity to share the understanding and to continue to move forward with it. It was the amount of life that I was paying for the insights that I was having became more and more cost for less and less insight, to the point that something had to give. And the darkness of that, and when I was able to get away from that and overdoses and different things that happened, there was a sadness of letting go of the wonder of that world for the mundane. And at that point, you deal with enough pain, and I think that's part of what we're going to. I'm not sure if I had put this together in this way, but we'll trade away wonder for a sense of security. So it was, I can push wonder away, I can push the bigness of the world as it appeared from these states for just a feeling of some kind of comfort, just for a feeling of maybe I won't die today. And there was a moment of relief from that, but But then there was one path laid out, and the path was to go back fully into the mundane, to almost make affirmations that what I had done, what I had been through was bad and should be moved to the side, and to come back in line. So while it pulled me away from that world and afforded me a sense of health and safety, it also, again, that darkness started to build of, okay, does it have to be one or the other? So I delved deeply into as many books as I could, as many different paths, traditions, passive liberation, freedom traditions, ancient and modern. So I joke around now that, that I'd be a Buddhist for a couple weeks, read everything I can get my hands on, and figure out that there was big holes in what that was or what that offered, I thought. And then I'd be Taoist for a while, and then maybe Zoroastrianism, and then a Kabbalist, and then a Christian mystic, and whatever it was that I can get my hands on to read in an attempt to find the portal, find the holy grail of something that was going to in a way try to connect this and deal with this sense of domicide, the sense of loss of home, of an inability to place myself within the bigness of the wonder and the reality of everyday life. And from that place, I'm taking big jumps, but from that place, I had some kind of insight that just the intellectual aspects of what I was doing weren't enough. I wasn't finding, no book seemed to have this. So I don't even think it was rationally or linearly thought out, but I decided that maybe yoga or Tai Chi or something physical was an option, or maybe a way to fill in these gaps and kind of embody this understanding. And it really wasn't anything specific that drew me to something like yoga. It was between yoga and Tai Chi, which were the two things that had some sense of magic to them in the way people would move. Tai Chi was harder to find where I was. There was a yoga training within, I think 2 weeks from when I had that thought. So yoga was the more lubricated path, the more well-worn path, in that I had taken one yoga class, and it wasn't a good one, before I decided to take a training. And I think now, and it's still words are clumsy, they always are, but it was this sense of something in me is trying to say something, and it's not there yet in a sense, or why would anyone, including myself, listen to this? Like, something else needs to be there, some kind of platform needs to be there in order for whatever it is that's playing inside me to find its way out. So I took a yoga training. It was fine. I was the most remedial person in that room. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't hold a lunge. I couldn't do any kind of twisting without falling over. I knew nothing about the lingo or the language of it. Everybody seemed much further along than I did. I had notebooks, and I would write lines in Sanskrit to try to memorize what all of these things were. But I stayed with it. I understood. I enjoyed the movement, the challenge, the physical challenge of it. I understood, in a sense, some of what they were trying to say with the philosophy, but there was still this huge gap between the physical practices that was being delivered and this incredibly vast amount of philosophy that not even the person that was trying to teach me seemed to have a grip on. So again, this wasn't a completion of anything. I ended up hoping that I would kind of figure this out one day if I put on the right outfits and I spoke the right way and I memorized the right things, that somehow this would make sense at some point. Very gratefully, in some kind of grace, I ended up going to a class with a teacher, a young guy who was about 10 years younger than me at the time. And in his class, not a lot of heavy philosophy, not a lot of history about anything, but just in the way that he had us move our bodies. There was an experience at the end of that was fascinating to me, that something else seemed to become available in that moment, in the way that I was thinking and feeling, and some kind of cohesion started to happen within the ideas, nothing that I could quite put into words yet and wrestle down into the verbal communication, but something sparked, and wanted to know what this was, because this seemed to have an inkling of possibly what they were talking about in the ancient books and in the ancient stories, about this kind of physical access to something more, to a deeper way of seeing, of understanding. So I began to follow him around. We were were teaching in the same studio, but I was completely out of my element. I didn't know enough to teach. I knew that, and I was terrified of public speaking. I needed to put on this big persona with all of this energy and work myself up almost into this frenzy in order to teach. And what I would do is I'd go to his classes and I'd try to write down exactly what he said, because I knew if I could just like capture exactly the words that he would use, that I can get people to feel something, to start to touch into these places. So I would go after classes with him, and I would have my notebook, and I would ask him, be like, well, you said this, so what do I do with this? And he would graciously answer my questions, and I would take these questions home, and I would do what he said, and I would practice, and I would try to get within this experience. And then I would go the next time, and I would be like, well, you said this, but when I do this, this happens. What do you think? And again, I would write down. I'd just be studying his words. And as he would tell the story later on, I thought I was bothering him. I felt bad, and I felt guilty about, constantly annoying this guy. And he was smiling. And the reason that he was smiling is that he was saying that as time went on, my questions were getting better and better, and his ability to answer them were getting less and less. So there was a shift somehow, and
The student became the teacher.
in a sense it was more of a fellowship where we were being more in dialogue with these questions. And I didn't, again, this is me looking back now, unbeknownst to me, he was already had it in his mind that we would be working together. And he invited me to take over his classes when he wasn't there. And I sat in on a teacher training because I begged him, can I just sit in the back? I won't bother anybody. I'll just stay there quietly. Let me know when I can just come in like a mouse. And the day that he's like, okay, well, you can come tomorrow if you'd like. I went in there and I sat in the back all quietly, and he called me over. He's like, no, sit here. And he had me sit next to him. And as the thing went on and the training went on, he broke everybody up into groups. And at one point he told me, he's like, well, you take that group and take care of them. And we ended up teaching together, developing what eventually became known as Fluidus together. I would work with him. His father and his sister worked with spinal injuries and were surgeons. So he was working on some of the recovery rehabs for them, and I would work with him, and that became another area of exploration of how we were moving people's bodies within a practice, and what was going on within these more difficult situations. And that started to give us more and more insight about where to go forward. I started traveling to find who his teachers were and spending some time with them, and basically questioning them. And what started to happen is that the blind spots became more and more obvious. The places that we would only go back so far, even within the teachers, until the point that the answer was, well, I don't know, that's just what I was taught. And I could only go back so far, where there was this chasm of the unknown and the holes, where the understanding of why we were doing certain things seems to have been lost. And again, there was still these holes between what the philosophy was and how we were asking people to move. And again, filling out those holes over time became this hero's journey, in a sense, this quest. And no medical training, no real philosophical training for me. So since no one could answer my questions, for some reason, I refused to let that go, and began to research and practice and write about what I was experiencing within the movement, and seeing if I could find someone, whatever modality at this point it was, whether it was within the medical establishment, within other movement practices, psychology, anthropology, physiology, whatever it was. But since I couldn't read, I would get these texts, and I would sit down to read these texts. And then I realized I can't read this text. I don't have the understanding to read this text, so I'd have to put that text to the side, find something else that would teach me how to read this one. Couldn't read that one, so I had to go back far enough where I could read something that would teach me how to read the next thing, that would teach me how to read the next thing. And over time, this started to fill in some of the gaps, fill in some of the holes, and started to develop an understanding, or at least a theory of what may be happening. And again, that's where Fluidus started to take on a different shape of trying to fill that hole, where we started to bring in psychology, philosophy, linguistics, human development, mythology, and seeing where's the through line, where's the intersection of all of this, where's the place where phenomenological truth and objective truth intersect. I think that's a long story semi-short on what at least got me to the place of having this thing be something that seemed like it was more than me at this point, where it was no longer anything that I was doing, but it seemed like something that had always been there, that we were starting to be able to translate and doing our best to, again, put words to this thing that was out there. And I think my ignorance was the biggest gift, since I didn't know. Not only did I know, I also didn't know what I shouldn't do or what questions not to ask or who not to offend. So the purity of my ignorance, in a sense, afforded me the ability to ask the questions that were bad form, in a sense, that you don't ask. So not knowing any better, I would ask, and I wasn't easily dissuaded by superficial answers. In a simple way, I could say that that's led to this.
Wow. I didn't know that. I mean, not to that extent. It's such a beautiful way of looking at the world. I mean, you often use the term, I've heard you say, we are kids pretending to be adults, because we very rarely walk through this life with that sense of curiosity and inquisitiveness. We are kind of traditionally taught to absorb information and not necessarily to distill it. So through the process of, I suppose, self-inquiry, that is the thing that leads us to new frontiers. You know, it's kind of like saying, I suppose, the earth is flat. No, actually, time goes on, it's actually round. And then we get to believe that the earth is round. And it's only through particular individuals who stand up and question society, because it is society at large. I mean, you're talking about ancient texts of different lineages, of different traditions and modalities that, you know, I often feel like there are these fly-by-night teachers who don't go through this process. And it's a very fine line, because, you know, that can take the magic and mystery away from someone who could have been going in that direction. So I can completely relate, because I've also had a very convoluted path. It started off quite traditionally, studying architecture, but then it went through so many different journeys. And if I think back on it, so many of the things that I started, I had absolutely no idea about. Mine was generally through seeing something in the world that I just couldn't resonate with, and felt that it was unjust, or there was a sense of frustration around it, and wondering, well, I'm sure there's a solution, you know, and then my problem-solving nature would just kick in. And I, you know, instead of necessarily like producing a building at the end of it in bricks and mortar, there'd be some kind of other response to that, and go, well, what about this idea, or what about this program or this platform? And, you know, and then enabling others to have the same process of inquiry, but within their own means or creativity, I should say. So there is something really beautiful about that innocence and not knowing. And I think that it also makes other people quite receptive to it, because you're coming from such a fresh perspective. You're not asking the same questions, and that is quite refreshingly challenging for them. So I can understand. And you're speaking about your very close friend now. Please just remind me of his name.
Sure. Yeah, his name is Jason Launer, or I can say is or was. He passed away very recently, just a few weeks ago. He passed away, and not in a tragic way, in a sense. It was a ski accident, but I mean, he was the epitome of living life. He was Devin, my partner, talks about him as kind of this ultimate archetype of balance, where he had this deep but simple spiritual practice, this deep connection to himself, and also completely within the world. So this beautiful bridge of that, and it's what he loved to do. He loved to climb, he loved to ski, he loved to hike and camp, and I mean, that's the last thing that he was doing within the thing that he loves. But yeah, he was my younger big brother, in a sense. Yeah, he was my younger big brother.
I'm so sorry about that. I know that it's very raw and recent.
Yeah.
But I also think that there is a legacy and a paying it forward in what you're doing now. And maybe you knew all of that was in preparation for some kind of eventuality, I suppose. And I probably think that because of your outlook already being the way that it is, you are able to understand another dimension already, and that there's a comfort in that many people don't necessarily have.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said, and I think one of the issues is I just prefaced the word domicide, where it's like, homicide and domicile. So domicide is like this death of home. What we've lost our mythic center, a way to appropriately place ourselves in existence in a way that not only makes material sense, but it makes emotional sense, that it goes along with the inner sense of ourselves, instead of just this idea, this Cartesian idea, when there was like this schism or this split where we left the superstitions, and I'm putting that in quotations because I don't think that we realized what we were doing when we did that. There was a lot that needed to be refined and refreshed and have ourselves released from the control of. But in a sense, we threw the baby out with the bathwater when we did that within our Cartesian split, where we split mind and material, and the father of science, we ended up going down this reductionist path where these old stories, these myths, since the rituals that we had were seen as childlike and unnecessary without use, and instead of just getting rid of the control and the pathology of some of the things that were going on, there's been an attempt over the last, I don't know how many 100 years to get rid of all of that. And what we did, in a sense, is we got rid of a deep part of ourselves, in a misunderstanding of what myth is. A myth is something that's not necessarily true in detail, but is deeply true in pattern, intergenerationally. So this is intergenerational wisdom about who we are, about our relationships with existence, with our own emotions, with our sense of self, with something like birth and death, and who we are. Those things have been wrestled with for thousands and thousands of years, and that wisdom that was trying to be put forward, it was pushed off to the side, and what we're left with now is a world that's extremely comfortable in a relative sense. We've never been more comfortable. We've never been more rich. Again, it's not to say that there aren't people that struggle deeply, but if we're looking at it as a complete package, it's the most resourced, rich, technological, knowledge-filled world that has ever been. And it's also the most meaningless world, in a sense. People feel more and more disconnected, more and more aching and longing for the sense of themselves. So the richer we are, the more resources we have, this sense of disconnection has actually grown, which is troubling. Some extremely beautiful people are discussing this as the meaning crisis, that we have a meaning crisis going on, this domicide and this meaning crisis, where we no longer know how to place ourselves outside of the reductionist model, outside of the get the next thing model, and that satisfies a certain part of ourselves, but we're distracting ourselves from these other big questions as if they're unimportant. And they're not unimportant. I mean, we have funny modern words for something like midlife crises. Well, what is that? That's basically what you've been aiming at for so long, all of a sudden loses that sense of fulfillment for you. Because at the beginning, you don't know any better, so you think it's coming. You go to school, well, you graduate, you go to the next level. You graduate, you go to the next level. You graduate, you go to university. Well, okay, what's next? Well, you graduate university, maybe you go to higher education. Okay, what's next? Well, now you get a job. Okay, what's next? Now you get promoted. Okay, what's next? You get promoted a little further. Okay, what's next? You get to the top of your field. Okay, I'm here. Well, now you wait for retirement. And that starts to you start to realize that you felt pretty much the same when you got to the top of your field than you felt, 20 years before. Like nothing big has happened. You don't feel any more full of meaning. Like those things inside you haven't been satisfied in any real way. And now you have this other part of like, I've invested so much in this life, in this story, and now I've gotten here, and it's not satisfying to me. Something in me is still vacuous, and empty. And then we try to do different things to fulfill that. We can go off to a place like Bali and go try to fill that up with a spiritual materialism in a sense, which is funnily what ends up happening a lot of times, because we take the same patterns that we had from within that other world and we try to superimpose them on the spiritual. So now it becomes about, well, how many workshops have I done? How spiritual do I look? How many people love me? How many, am I wearing the right clothes? How many books have I read? How long can I meditate for? And again, we get to that same place because it's the pattern underneath, that the vision of ourselves, that mythic center that's not being addressed. The proper placement, the ratio religio. Religio means binding, ratio in a sense of ratio, of this proportionate binding of ourselves to present, the future, and the past, to myself as a material being, to the sense of myself as this mythic creature of consciousness, and the sense of myself within the infinitude of reality, and to properly proportion these things. And I think that ratio has been off balance, and fundamentalism is in a sense that crash back of trying to fill that hole from the same place, but it becomes the same idea where we're trying to fill ourselves with menus. We're eating menu after menu after menu and wondering why we're not getting satisfied the way that we would by a meal.
So I align very much with you when it comes to this unlearning model, because I also feel that it's taken us in a direction that is, in your words, unnatural. And, so that it completely leads down that path of dissatisfaction. And also disposability. I don't know if you remember way back when, and I showed you this program that I was doing at UCT called Upstart, and there was a video basically animating exactly what you've just described, and how we are designed to almost fall off that conveyor belt at some time and at some point and get replaced, unless we actually look within and understand what is our purpose here. What is our passion? Who are we? And ask these really important questions that we generally bypass en route to qualifying as something or from something and getting a title and a job description. We forget to, play more in nature. We forget to kind of reconcile this external world with the internal world. And it's because we don't have this wonder curriculum, in a sense, which should be common knowledge, because if it was common knowledge, then we wouldn't necessarily have to go and tap on other people's doors to help heal us, to help redirect us and all these kind of things, because we'd go through these experiences as opposed to this dogmatic information that kept coming at us versus us going through more of a questioning process. And I know that there are schools, different schools of inquiry, and I suppose the Waldorf types, those that have now progressed even further or used that as a starting point and found different ways to integrate this knowledge better through more of an experiential learning, but it's very few and far between. It's certainly not mainstream. And so how do you feel, because we're sitting, for example, in inverted commas, in your school and learning this information. Whenever I'm in a class of yours, I watch other people who've never had this information before, and just like the light bulb goes off, because you realize that it's so innate. I mean, you almost kind of go, obviously, in a way, but that information is so out of one's reach that you have to have someone reignite it for you, which is what you do, but that's in a small, closed, contained environment. So how do you think this kind of knowledge becomes much more widespread?
It's going to take some time. The reason that I say that is, let me give you an example. There's a difference between a transformational experience and a quote-unquote ordinary experience or transcendental experience and an ordinary experience. And you can think of ordinary experiences being in this horizontal plane where we're riding the same line and we can improve, but we're basically going to improve in in just one direction. We're going to get better at the same world that we're in increments. It's not going to afford us to do anything truly different. We're just going to move along this one line where it's better in quantity but not necessarily in quality. So so someone's sense of contentedness will be a little better. And that's the world that we're in. So my concern, even when you were speaking about these others that are working from within this inquiry, you're talking about the system itself as it is, giving us ways of being slightly more content within the system itself. So what's necessary? We can think about it this way: if we all had rose-colored glasses on and looking through the rose-colored lenses, as much as we squint, we're going to see everything rose-colored, and we can have ideas about what this is, and we can have abstract thoughts about what blue might be like, but we're only going to be able to look through these frames. So what transformational experiences are is a way of affording us access into a vertical perspective, a vertical shift, where we're not just moving along the same axis, but there's this moment of inspiration or transcendence that affords us this leap out of our everyday framing, and that's what's not happening, and that's what's I don't even believe that it's happening within those that are on the edges, trying to make education a little bit better from within more or less the same model, because if you go too far, there's too much of a reaction, no one's going to back you, and all of these practical reasonings for this. So my concern is that some bigger shift in this is going to need to happen. True to what you said, we're not taught to think. We're not taught to question. The humanities are no longer taught. I work with this gentleman, this British gentleman, Tommy, and Tommy is a storyteller. He travels the world and he collects these ancient myths, and he leads these retreats and these workshops where they flesh out these stories over a weekend's time or a week's time, and you dream with these stories, and this is storytelling for transformation more than it is for information. Again, these stories, these old myths, were trying to take us to a place inside of ourselves that was not so easily stated in our linear world, in our linear understanding, and these small mouth sounds that we've overglorified in our verbal language. And these stories had that capacity to transmit wisdom, and I'll use wisdom in the sense of rationality, and I'll use rationality in the sense, again, of this rationing, this putting ourselves appropriately. It's not just how much information I have. That's not wisdom. It's where do I place this information? What does this information do to me? Like, where do I put myself within the hierarchy of the world? What's relevant to me? What pieces of the information and knowledge are useful now, and which pieces are irrelevant to me right now? So when we say wisdom and rationality, that's what's missing. We're overloaded with information already, like knowledge on tap, literally knowledge on tap. At the push of a finger, we have any child, even in a third world country that has some kind of smartphone, has access to more information than the president of the United States had in the 80s. I mean, that's ridiculous. But we have no capacity to use that in a real way, in a way that affords us this transcendental wisdom that we're talking about. So this idea that what we need to know how to do is we need to know how to think. We need to understand ourselves in the Socratic thought of know thyself. It's not know thyself like know your history. It's know thyself like know how you think. Know how you see things. Know why you see things. It's the capacity to not just look through the lenses, but it's the capacity to be able to look at the lenses, to understand that we're seeing through filters, to understand that we're already seeing through something. And again, those kinds of things afford us this leap out of the horizontal and into the vertical, where now things can be placed in a different way. So even within these experiences, I think it's a step in the right direction. But again, my concern is the absorption of these things by culture, and even in the ways that we talk about them, about saying you're going to have workers that are better for you. So basically telling the system, hey, it's okay to let them do this because you're going to get people that are going to be more efficient, and you're going to be able to go on with the world, and your workers are going to be better, and your profit margin is going to be better, and your ROI, your return on investment is going to be better. We're still playing within the horizontal. We're still playing within this this dimension, and these things have a tendency to get absorbed by culture. Culture is like a moving freighter on the ocean. It's not going to change easily. And you hinted at something when you said it's outliers on the edges that start to flick. It was the job of, in the old courts, it was the job of the jester or the joker to constantly be in the king or queen's ear. And it was like the one person in the court that wouldn't get beheaded for saying the wrong thing. It was in service of the court. It was in service of the court that this one, whenever the king or the queen or the politicians got too high and mighty, for someone in the ear to say, it's like, you're not really believing all this stuff, are you? You're not taking yourself that seriously, are you? This is a joke. So that offense in the service of the mythic is something that frighteningly we're losing right now, where there's this movement to never offend anything, and to have, in response to this over restriction on a deep part of ourselves, the backlash to this, or the elastic response to this, a slingshot in the other direction, has been as pathological as the first date, where, well, my identity is completely into my own hands, where it's like, well, it's just about me and whatever I think, whatever I feel, and that's going to be my God. And again, we're playing at two extremes, and we've lost something there. There's, again, this appropriate rationing and binding to the I that I know, and also the mysterious I that I don't know. So again, where do we place that? The humility of, I know about this much of what I am. So, and then it's a tiny island of knowing in this ocean of mystery about what I am. That who I am goes backwards and forwards through time, in a sense. That I didn't just come out of nothing, or I didn't just come into this world empty. There's a long line of humanity that flows through me, a long line of consciousness that flows through me. There's something about me that's mythical and transcendent, and is not easily reduced into material verbal language. And that's when I hinted earlier that we lost something within the Descartesian split. We need a new mythos that satisfies that mysterium of who we are, but also satisfies our intellect at the same time. So we don't have to sacrifice an aspect of ourself to bring in the other parts of ourselves, and to bring these together in a very real way, and bring these conversations back to teach us how to wrestle with these ideas, to not, like you said, not just, who answers the memorization quickest and best. But it's like, well, you put a question, it's like, well, I don't know yet. I'm going to need to wrestle with this for a while. I'm going to wrestle with this in my life, and within dialogue, to have that real dialogue. And real dialogue means that there's some kind of sacred commitment to unveiling something as we speak together, instead of protection of my identity and individual will, where what I'm trying to do is debate and prove my rightness in the face of your rightness. So we're all, in a sense, walking around as fundamentalists, going in there because there's no home. We don't have a connection to this place. So we're all defending like the little corner of ourselves that we're trying like hell to hold on to, because it feels like it's the only thing that's stemming the tide of this existential crisis that's trying to crash down around us. Instead of it being this community that's moving itself closer to wisdom, that we throw ideas into the arena, not because I'm identifying with them, but because through that dialogue, hopefully within this distributed cognition, like your mind and my mind together are better than just my mind. So we get to spread out our understanding. In a sense, that's what culture is meant to be. It's this distributed cognition that goes forward through time with what the ancients had taught us, in a sense. But to be able to, again, bring this back, this dialectic, this dialogos, this ability to commit to dialogue with the effect of both of us becoming more enriched and more wise afterwards, even if that means that either of us or both of us were a little bit offended from the conversation. That's something that I held on to, like my identity is going to have to die in order for something richer to come forward. And I think that's what's been missing. Even these kinds of conversations, like we're not having these kinds of conversations. We're having conversations about what is right and what is wrong, about, whether that story in that ancient book, here's historical documents that prove that detail didn't happen. We're missing something deeply. We're missing myth as intergenerational wisdom, as something true in pattern, that without that, we're taking our fertile soil out from underneath us that had supported us for so long. And now we're floating, and there's a danger because we've gotten so technologically advanced that it's more dangerous for us now to not have a way to properly place ourselves within existence. So that's a struggle. That's the struggle as I see it, to have these conversations come back, to begin to teach people how to think, how to wrestle, how to question, how to have a broader perspective of what myth is beyond the reductionist idea of whether it was true in detail or not. Because if we think that somehow, let me put it this way, if somehow someone gets rid of all their myths, all their ancient stories, and decides on their own that they're going to take on the questions of consciousness and existence, and they're going to start from scratch, how far can they get? If so many of these ideas had thousands of years of understanding and wrestling and questioning and dialogue and fleshing them out and trying to understand through mythology and through symbology and through all of these things, trying to come to some kind of understanding, that instead of standing on the shoulders of those giants and continuing to move this understanding forward, refining it over and over, letting go of what doesn't make sense, and like gold in the fire, have it be purified over time, that we're going to get rid of all of it and try to create it all from scratch. That's not going to happen. So this new mythos, this new understanding needs to be some kind of bridge between this deep well of mythology and philosophy and wisdom and intelligence from the giants of the ancient world, because they were not dumb. They were as modern in their thinking as we are. They just had less access to information. But we could take what they wrestled with and bridge it with our current understanding, and then see if we can pull that wisdom forward instead of drawing a line in the sand and trying to get rid of it and just focusing on this one aspect of who we are, which, if the evidence continues to show itself, it is nowhere near enough for us to have our full humanity, our full consciousness, our full understanding, the richness that's promised.
That is powerful. I'm sitting here thinking, and I have a lot of questions for you. They're popping out of my head. And, the world as we know it has been designed as it's an economic model. So, and the educational system prepares one for this economic model. And so everything that you're saying actually doesn't necessarily benefit the economic model. And that's what has become very dominant. And those on top are very fearful of the model you describe because they don't want to be questioned. So it's much easier, as we know, to control through fear and to keep people at a certain level where the knowledge that they get is the knowledge that is prescribed. So I'm asking, this is not even it's not my answer necessarily, but if it is about, when you say this process is incremental, I understand that, because it's when there almost has to be a tipping point of outliers in order for the paradigm to shift so that the original model crumbles and a new one is born. Not necessarily a new one to replace it so directly, but one, as you say, is much more all-encompassing. And in my speak, what I say develops you into a whole being, a whole human being, where you are inquiring about every single aspect of you in order to come into this holistic alignment. And when you've accessed that, that is when I do believe that this magic and wonder, as you speak about it, is very accessible. And it doesn't become taboo. And I think that that's the other interesting thing. I mean, way back when, people who believe this were labeled witches and were burned at the stake. And each kind of era has brought its own variety of these kind of individuals who just don't subscribe to society as it's been outlined. And so I think you've just described really in a very powerful and interesting way of almost creating this balance where there's a respect going on between these different ways of thinking, but at the same time, like where you see, you have to have, it's almost like a family, I would say. You can't exist in isolation. Your family is there to provide all these different call it resources in term, whether it's shelter and food and all of those kinds of basics, but it's also love and it's compassion and it's friendship and it's learning and it's all of these things. So the same thing at a macrocosmic level is what has really been broken down, I think, over time. It's still the core values that have been broken down, which is why you say that, there are all these kind of, the world seems to be so fragmented in its, it's different. There's just such misalignment within oneself and within each other. And so for you, what does it look like physically, in other words? Because it's one thing to talk about philosophy and say, well, we should have, people just inquiring or whatever, but one actually has to integrate that into a society that can incrementally shift. And there obviously are those, powerful forces that, if we look at it in terms of infrastructure, there are schools, there are universities. I mean, obviously there's online now. I think that maybe that is the technology you speak of that is springboarding us to a different type of knowledge and wisdom because it's more selective. So how do you foresee this new state of thinking or paradigm or dimension materializing, or is it what you've created in Floridas?
So much there in what you said. Now, at the beginning when you started speaking, you were speaking about people in power, and people in power commit suicide too. If they're human, they're suffering from the same thing. And there's this empty ghost or hungry ghost phenomena where it's not enough. It's like nothing is enough. I mean, once you get to $1 billion, like even a lot less than that, what's the gain to go further than that and again, unless it's unknown. It's like I'm trying to get satisfied. I'm trying to get contentment. I'm trying to fill this whatever it is inside me, and no matter how much I put in myself, I can't get to the other side of that. That's innate in the culture that we're talking about in this idea, and it's a resource economy. But I think we've made a mistake in thinking that we know what's going to satisfy that, and that's been one of the biggest things where we're given a story from down to top, because these people that are in power now, they didn't just come into a blank world and create this. In a sense, they jumped right on that same path underneath the story that was already there, and they're the ones that have run ahead and to try to get as much as they can, but they're still living within that dissatisfaction, and it's pretty obvious. You get a superstar, all the money in the world, fanfare, universally loved, and they're miserable, and there's a deep depression in them. So unfortunately, the evidence is massive around us that it doesn't matter where you get to, what tier you're in within this. After you have a certain amount, basically, your basic needs are met. After that, the amount of satisfaction or happiness or meaning that you get as your salary rises is almost negligible once you get to a certain level. Like, definitely basic needs and medical care and those things are important. But once you move past that, it's definitely not on equal par with the more that I have, the happier that I am. Sometimes it's backwards. You become a prisoner more and more of this thing. So the kind of resources that we're talking about, the kind of fulfillment that we're talking about, goes all the way up the line for this. It's going to change one way or the other. Now, if these things have changed throughout time. There's been already, and we can look back through history at moments of these big shifts, the Renaissance, the Descartes split, the axial revolution. If you go back, into the ancient Greek times, these moments where something shifted in the ways that we saw things, that everything else shifted underneath. But it's going to start, in a sense, we can imagine it coming from bottom up and top down at the same time, because that's how our cognition works, that's how the world works. But again, this capacity to think to create what I call an ecology of practices to fill. I mean, it's already happening. The New Age is in direct response to this meaning crisis, this taking away of our stories, to this domicide, and what's going on is a strange fundamentalism in the other direction now, where at the beginning it was, well, any kind of superstition is strange and we should push that out there, when traditional religion was, the scapegoat for that, where we push all the traditional religions into the corner, and you can be over there on your little street corner as long as you don't infect our lives with your nonsense. And now we've gone in the other direction, where all this New Age stuff, and people were willing to believe all of these other things to try to connect themselves back into the thing that religion used to fill within their lives, the sense of the contemplation of the infinite, the contemplation of the mystery beyond the unsatisfactory story of the day-to-day that I'm being fed from the consumer culture, which is not satisfying those places in myself. So this is already happening. Go to any bookstore, look at the self-help section and philosophy section. It's not, in my world, that's not philosophy. It's a bastardization, in a sense. It's theurgy, not in the good sense of a modern spell casting in order to try to shift your reality within whatever languages are acceptable in your paradigm. Let's say, 5 steps to enlightenment, 10 steps to a better you. Whatever this is, we can label it as something else, but there's already, if you're looking from the business model, and the customers are already out there clamoring for something that works, and nobody's actually providing anything. So none of the products that are being provided are actually satisfying in a real way the need that's being put out there. And that's the place that we're at. There's a huge vacuum for something meaningful. And right now we're within this horizontal that something else has the opportunity to come in here. It's almost like the ground is fertile for this. Is it going to be easy? No. Is there going to be tough responses? Yes. But the conversations need to start about something different than what we have now. People don't know what they don't know. If this is the only path that they've been giving to contentment and quote-unquote happiness, so then they're going to say, because we all have the idea, right? The reason that we stay on this path is because we think that if we get to the next stage, it's going to be there for me. So I think I can get there. Those are the people that defend the system strongly, are the people that are in some kind of state that they still believe that if they get there, that somehow the system has something for them at the end. And that's, even if it's somebody low, as long as they've bought in to this idea, they'll continue to defend this, because they're looking through the lenses. They're within the horizontal. So what we need is a way for them to stand beyond their lenses. And again, this ecology, this idea of ecology of practices, these transformational experiences that afford us ecstasies in the old sense, and ecstasies in the way that you stand beside yourself, in a sense, that you're afforded the ability to see beyond your own framework for a moment. It's what psychedelics provide, in a sense. It's what contemplative practices provide. It's for a moment, the way that you see the world broadens, that you see beyond your normal ways of seeing, where there's this connection of different things that are coming in through our emotional states, so they're coming in through our intellect, through our physical practices. And it's in this intersection that something else starts to take shape. We become so intellectual. And there's no aspect of ourselves that doesn't have the capacity to deceive us. Meaning the body has a capacity to deceive us, the intellect has a capacity to deceive us, our emotions definitely have a capacity to deceive us, our fears have a capacity to deceive us. So all of these things have the capacity to deceive us. So going in through just one of these places is not going to be enough. Even if we're just master of our own domain, I'm my own guru, that still has the capacity to deceive us. So having practices that connect these different things, to have something that we can offer people, that they can connect to the ways that they move, that they can get in touch with themselves as in their emotions within community and dialogue, where they get to challenge others' ideas and have their ideas challenged, where they get to understand their physicality, where they get to understand their emotions, where they get to contemplate and read and go into their intellect on their own. And it's in this intersection. There's something powerful when truth starts to intersect across different planes, that it affords us something. We can never fully know the truth because we just know the best that we know now. But let's say that we can move further and further from self-deception and closer to rationality and wisdom and towards the horizon of something that's true. So instead of coming at this psychologically or within a debate, again, bring back ritual in a way that's not only intellectually acceptable, but intellectually responsible to begin this conversation. And that's what I'm doing here with you. And that's what I've been trying to do, to bring in these ideas that this is not like something on the edges of your capacity to believe it. This is well within our capacity to understand its importance if we start to bring in things like cognitive science, like psychology, and bring these things in to make ritual and myth intellectually responsible, and to start to inspire those to take on practices that will put us in the appropriate state to see beyond our current situation. And it's really that grassroots first. We can talk about it from up here, inspire those up here, but really what we're inspiring is individuals, to get individuals within these practices, have them connect again, to be inspired to not only identify themselves with the small island of the them that they know, but the rich ocean that surrounds them, of the they that's mysterious, the they that encompasses things like consciousness, like connection to others, the aspirational self, the relationship between the past self and the future self, and all of these things that we can infuse, and I was going to say infect, actually, to infect like into the very bloodstream of who we are, and have those things come alive. Because what we're doing isn't anything, we're not creating anything that's new. We're trying to translate something inherent and essential about what it is to have a human experience, something that's been put aside and put to sleep. And our words are merely clumsy attempts to get those to look again and to reawaken our connection with that. So coming in at the grassroots place with practices that afford us the cognitive flexibility to be able to sense ourselves in the mythic sense as well as the intellectual sense, to take our modern capacity to understand and reason, and again, to pull those other things forward in a way that's satisfying to our whole being. And I think that's the capacity that needs to happen. It's not going to be easy necessarily, but I think it's going to be like when the kindling is ready, the smallest spark is going to light it. So what we're doing is we're running around with matches, I guess, and trying to find the places where the kindling is ready to light and to spark, because this will be a snowball. It's nothing new that we're trying to bring in within the ecology of practices of Fluidus. We're tapping into something that's been known for a long time to be a part of us. Those scientists at the edges understand what I'm talking about. They understand that we have some idea that someone out there smarter than us knows what consciousness is, knows where we come from, knows what existence is, knows how we think, knows what dreams are. But that is absolutely not true. There's something profound about who we are that's going to forever be mysterious to us. It's almost written within existence itself that what we can do is we're never going to fully wrestle it down into some kind of full understanding. We're going to have to come to terms with a relationship with the mystery. And it's a knowing beyond our capacity to linearly write it down into sentences and be succinct with it. It's an experience that's going to go beyond that, to bring this into our awareness of who we are in a very real way. And that's what Fluidus is, in a sense, and that's what we've been doing to revivify this ecology of practices, to bring this cognitive science aspect, to bring myth and meaning back in a way that it satisfies us, and again, to make it something that we take on, not in something that you do on the side. You said not just a philosophy, and I'd say, well, not just a philosophy as an intellectual exercise, but philosophy as a way of life, of taking these insights and living as if, experimenting with them, taking them on, wrestling with them with each other. Where you mentioned things like virtues. Well, where did the virtues come from? Why is love something that's important? Why is selflessness important? nobody's talking about these things in a real way. Like, why should I care about someone next to me? If survival is the ultimate thing and getting the next best thing is all that it's for, then would selflessness really be a part of that? Like, why is there something that speaks to all of us that doesn't have necessarily a direct connection to my individual survival, but is still important to me? Why is justice a thing that I care about? Why does that touch human beings in a certain way? Like, even to talk about those kinds of things without this connection to something else, to the mythic, or to the vivifying of ourselves as more than what we understand. Like, even those things become very flimsy. And that's what we're seeing also.
I'm sitting here and I feel like this incredible, there's this calmness that's come over me. And I'm also smiling because when I sit in a room with you, and this has happened so many times, it feels like the heaviness of the world disappears, in the sense that what you are saying is what you call your philosophy, which is this return to wonder. When you truly think about that, and there's such a lightness that comes with it. There's like this joy, and the usual references to children and how they laugh and how they play, in the sense of innocence, and how they pick up the smallest little thing and study it for hours. It's not about the biggest toy or most colorful object. I mean, they can pick up a piece of sand and just study it and wonder about it. And then an adult's wonder comes in watching them do that. There's just this beautiful process of that being your reminder about that piece of sand. With you, I know that your portal in is through the body, and it's through movement. And from our own experience of that, it's so true, because you talk about the intellect and the philosophy and the spirit, and all of these things can feel out of reach for many people. But we all have a body. We are all on and of this earth. And I think the other day you said we are between heaven and earth, which is, I thought, another beautiful way of expressing it. Only you can describe this the way that you describe it. But what resonated with me is when you speak about how, if you truly look at yourself, I mean, you started this class the other day and you went, what are you dreaming about right now? Who are you? What are you doing? And then, some people were like, I'm sitting, I was thinking about something, or, others try to be a little bit more profound. And you were like, you are moving your blood in your system and you don't even know. And when you bring in that sense of recognizing what's actually happening in your world beyond the surface, beyond the skin, then that changes everything, because then that sense of wonder is around you all the time. And it's this waking up, and what you kind of call this opportunity that if we actually experienced this for even a millisecond within our systems, it would change everything. And this idea of having such reverence. And I think that when you bring that level of appreciation to this thing we call the body, then I think that everything else can be understood through this vessel.
Very well said. That's our philosophy. It's
I learned from the best.
It is our most intimate. It's got the possibilities for our most intimate relationship with something, to put words on it, the ground of being, in a sense, where it's, and the stories are softer. I don't have to go through a lot of philosophical acrobatics and go through people's stories and what they identify with and what their religion was and what their backgrounds and what they believe. If I just tell them to, put their hands somewhere or move their arm somewhere, it's the entryway into another is easier in the sense that I can bypass a lot of the stories and get them into that state. There's something really true when we say that reverence is a state that comes with right understanding or with right vision. That when we see something appropriately, reverence is the appropriate state that naturally comes, instead of trying to drape reverence over a feeling of not reverence and trying to just look at something and force ourselves to be reverence. Reverence doesn't work like that. Reverence is in a sense an instinct almost. The way that wonder or awe is an instinct. It's if you see something that just drops your mouth open in awe, your body will react instinctually. There'll be piloerection, meaning the little hairs on your arms will stand up. And that's within the autonomic nervous system. You don't have control and can force those little hairs to come up. Something happens beneath the surface when that contact and connection and understanding unveils itself. And the body is an entryway into that. And not only into that place, but it's this beautiful place to challenge the monadic self. So the monadic self is this idea like monomonadic, like that we're one thing, that we're one person, that we're one being or one expression. And it's an interesting idea that we all carry around, but we all know that we're fractured. We all know that we have these beliefs and ideas about the way that we should go through the world. And, we want to be kind and we speak nicely to everybody. And then something happens that pushes the button on the right day in the right circumstance. And we find ourselves screaming or saying things and just standing beside this looking like, who's that person? What happened to me? It was like a possession that came over me. And then we kill ourselves and, whip ourselves for doing this because we don't understand that we're something closer to, in Jung's word, this collection of autonomous entities outside the control of our linear ego.